And we're back. We have Marc Surdyka. We're going to try a new conversation topic set up for today. And I guess it's up totally to the listeners to decide if it's worth trying it again. Marc, before we dive into it, how's it going, man?
It's going well. I think I'm doing better than you, considering it took you 3 tries to just say my name in the intro.
Yep, I blacked out. We had to restart multiple times. Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm a little tired, but that's okay. I got my cold brew. You got your go-go juice, your little Lonnie next to you.
Yeah, Chris is a busy man. Full work week, 2 podcast recordings today, remote coaching and consultations today.
Mm-hmm.
You're on the go. I'm also doing another podcast later. We'll see how it goes.
That's right. I'm excited to hear how that one goes. All right, we're going to try a new setup. I thought of the idea. Mark's rolling with it. This is kind of an exploration, but right now the title is going to be People of the Internet. And the goal is looking at either one podcast or video or a variety of different clips, whether that's a shorts or TikTok videos or whatever it is, from essentially celebrity influencers, celebrity fitness, rehab, whatever it is, very, very well-known individuals on the internet, and watch or listen to these videos or podcasts and have a conversation around what do we like about some of these things these individuals are saying, what do we disagree with, do we have a middle ground? And I would say Marc and I both want to have this caveat early on that the conversation is not directed towards these disagreeing with these humans as people or trying to kind of attack them. It's to look at their recommendations, beliefs, views as the primary goal. And it shouldn't be that we're directed our attention towards this person as a human, more so what they're saying. Do you have any thoughts on that, Marc?
Yeah, so as I'll consider myself an educator here, and maybe you as well, being the podcast host. Yeah, several thoughts. So, like, one, I'm not really one for confrontation as it relates to making reels or shorts, what someone might describe as like calling out another video. And I try to limit my time on social media. So me like searching through the web looking for videos that I disagree with usually isn't the best use of my time or energy. However, I do understand that having these types of discussions can actually be helpful. Like you said, we're not attacking individuals, we're discussing ideas. And as healthcare providers and as educators, it's probably useful for us to discuss ideas that maybe we disagree with as a way to reduce misinformation or potentially harm. And there's probably good and bad, or like better and worse ways to navigate this. You know, if we are too blunt or we do attack the individual, it might create this kind of backfire effect with that individual or with their listeners. And then we're not really accomplishing anything. You know, the goal here isn't just to create this echo chamber where everyone agrees with me, because inevitably I'm going to get something wrong. And I hope my or our listeners are willing to understand and accept that, hey, just because he had this one idea wrong, you know, he's not a bad person or everything he says is wrong. Let's explore maybe why he was wrong or what he could have said differently. And, you know, there is a book. I don't know. Have you read Calling Bullshit?
Yes, I have a while back.
Yeah. So there's a book that came out years ago, and there's different iterations of this type of book too. Calling Bullshit by Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West. They're both professors at the University of Washington. And it's actually a really interesting read if you want to be a little bit more skeptical about things that you hear and see on the internet. It's kind of like a way to help you spot, navigate, and call out BS if needed. And like the last chapter in the book, they actually discuss that it's somewhat our duty to call out that BS, call out that misinformation. So if you wanted more information on this, like beyond just what we're talking about, I do think that that's a good book to kind of start with.
to your point early on, you aren't necessarily seeking out these pieces of information or this media. I think regardless, it just like gets sent to people. Like if I just log on to YouTube, it just shows up, these videos, or on podcasts, they're always present because they're some of the most popular ones. That being said, we're not going to just specifically call out one individual. We're going to have, hopefully, if this series continues, have a broad group of people from different areas that we can discuss. The first one I found, and I sent it over to Mark, but this was a podcast episode that was also on YouTube that was by Andrew Huberman, the Huberman Lab, and he's exploded over the past few years. I think his videos easily get hundreds of thousands or millions, who knows, the podcast downloads. But this was episode 79 with Jeff Cavalier, optimize your exercise program with science-based tools. We'll link the YouTube video for people who just want to follow along with what we discuss. Maybe not necessarily recommending listening to the whole video, but if you want to, what we're going to do today is we'll talk through what Andrew asked Jeff and what they both talk about. And if anyone wants to see actually what they're saying verbatim or the whole conversation, that's where you can go. A little intro on both of those individuals before we discuss certain parts of this video. Andrew Huberman, from my understanding, is associate professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford University. Somehow he's come into the podcast world and now interviews a wide variety of individuals, and his recommendations and the things he talks about now, I would say, far reaches away from his scope as a researcher in neurobiology and ophthalmology. Jeff Cavalier is a PT, A&C coach, trainer, and has Athlean X, this giant YouTube and fitness platform that he's most known for. So Andrew's interviewing Jeff, and there's a variety of topics that they go into, and we're not going to cover all of them because I think the total episode was 2.5 hours. What I did is I just scrubbed through different topics, and I want the goal to be giving some positives about what they're saying or talking about and how Jeff answers some questions, and then diving more into seeing things that Mark and I may disagree with. The first one, this kind of topic within the video and the podcast, was a fitness plan for general health. And for people who do want to re-listen or watch the video itself, it's around the 8-ish minute mark, 8 to 9-ish minute. Andrew asks Jeff, is there a specific ratio of someone who's generally wanting to get healthy, gain muscle mass, lose fat, this ratio of cardio versus resistance training? And this is a loose quote, but Andrew asks Jeff, the typical person that would like to maintain or add some muscle mass and be in good cardiovascular health, is it 50% resistance training, 50% cardio? Is it 70-30? Is it 30-70? Jeff's response is, I think it's like a 60-40 split, which would be leaning towards weight training, and the conditioning aspect would be about 40%. If you look at this over a training week, 5 days in the gym would be a great task, 3 days resistance training and 2 days cardio. That's his primary recommendation. He goes on to elaborate a little bit more. With that initial response, Mark, do you have any initial thoughts on just that kind of recommendation that Jeff has?
I mean, I don't think there's any harm in Jeff's recommendation, like getting into the gym 5 days per week. For a lot of people, that's a big task to actually accomplish. I would say that that recommendation is probably largely based on his preferences, doing 3 days of resistance training, 2 days of cardio, which, once again, nothing wrong with that. I think most physical activity guidelines would suggest 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week, which mathematically generally breaks down to about 30 minutes 5 times per week of so moderate intensity being like brisk walking, and then 2 days of full body resistance training. The time spent doing that resistance training, I don't think is specified like it is with, this moderate intensity physical activity. Or you could do 75 minutes of vigorous intensity, physical activity, which would be things like jogging or running. So that's probably where a lot of recommendations maybe stem from and you can work off of. And while also understanding and knowing that, probably more is going to be better to some extent. Obviously, there's going to be diminishing returns the more that you do. And then also understanding that if somebody is very inactive or completely sedentary, something is better than nothing, always. And for that person who is inactive or who is sedentary, just doing a little bit, even if they don't reach that 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity or the 2 times per week of resistance training, that little bit of activity is going to provide significant benefits for them. And as we both know, and maybe as a lot of the listeners know, most people aren't reaching those recommendations anyway. As a whole, we're fairly inactive. So that's why, no harm in Jeff's recommendation. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I would agree. We didn't really discuss our answers or thoughts on these specific topics. I just laid out certain ones, and my initial thoughts are the same, where zooming out, that what do we generally know from a national or international recommendation is those kind of volumes and times and frequencies you listed. There's a lot of wiggle room within that. I don't really inherently disagree with that recommendation, but I don't think Jeff's specific recommendation has to be fit for everyone. But I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. And if, let's say, hundreds of thousands or millions of people listen to that episode, it would probably work for a lot, but it also may feel too high of a goal for others at that point in time in their life. And giving the caveat of 1 time a week, 2 times a week of any type of exercise is significantly better than none. And it may be less paralyzing as a starting point recommendation. Also realizing that they'll still get substantial health benefits out of just that. And they don't have to start out at this 5 days a week in the gym.
Yeah. And I haven't listened to the podcast episode. I actually haven't listened to any of the Huberman podcast episodes. I think I tried once and it just wasn't for me, just for complete transparency. But like you said, yeah, sometimes those physical activity goals can feel daunting. And for people to understand that, just because they hear cardio or they hear resistance training or they hear the gym and they think that they actually have to go and do something, when in actuality, just accumulating steps throughout the day. And these could be in 5-minute bursts, right? It doesn't have to be 30 minutes. It doesn't have to be brisk. Maybe that's your goal and what you're shooting for over months or years. But if every once in a while you're doing a 5-minute walk and before you weren't doing any walking, you're literally taking steps to better health.
Agreed. Second topic that they dive into, this is around the 13-ish minute mark for people who want to actually watch it and listen to it. This section is optimizing body part training splits. Andrew asks Jeff, what is an ideal split? What is the rules, or what are the rules and logic dictating a split? And Jeff proceeds to answer, for me, the first rule is, will you stick to it? And then there's another quote he has later on, a split not done is not effective. And he elaborates there, but we'll stop there, as that was kind of his initial recommendation or starting point. Mark, what are your thoughts with that?
I wholeheartedly agree. I think many people are looking for this quote unquote optimal when they should just be aiming for consistency. Once you've been in the gym for a while and then you're trying to achieve certain goals, maybe you're striving for that optimal, which you never actually achieve, right? Like optimal is a goal that continues to move. But yeah, I agree with that. If the workout doesn't get done, doesn't matter how effective that split is. Someone might say, well, the best split is 5 days of resistance training or 6 days of resistance training to build muscle. But that's a lot of time to spend in the gym, driving there, getting there, changing, whatever it is, showering. So maybe your optimal is just 3 days per week or 2 days per week, and maybe you're still getting 80% of what you would otherwise. So yeah, I agree. A split not done is not effective.
Agreed. Yeah, I don't have much else to add. I guess, surprised that that was his answer, and I am on the exact same page. Whatever is the most realistic and consistent for an individual. Sleep and sleep position. This is around the 50-minute mark. Andrew starts to bring up this topic about sleep, and then he loosely discusses his experience, and it made it sound like he had gotten this information from Jeff years prior and he decided to try it. But Andrew kind of goes down this little diatribe about his sheets felt like they were too tight and they were tucked in, and his foot position, he just kept calling them kind of floppy, just kind of a plantar flexed position, and how he had this experience untucking the sheets and then also adding in some tibialis work, some anterior tib work, it sounds like. He ended up saying that this kind of improved everything: his posture, his back pain, his shin splints. This is before he asks a question. This is just Andrew's own experience. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mark, or we can just kind of go into what he actually asked Jeff, but it was kind of a weird starting point and it doesn't really go anywhere. But I think it was, again, one of those, this takes a lot of steps and leaps as to what he's saying versus probably the reality of probably what we'll talk about, of whatever position is most comfortable. Yeah, let's just go into what he actually asked Jeff. What is kind of the ideal sleep position, and talk to us about sleep. And Jeff, again, this is a loose quote. He says, "You can incur pretty serious injuries while asleep. It's understandable that your body can incur some strain and stress if you're sleeping in the wrong way. One of the things I say right off the bat is that sleeping on your stomach just does not have many benefits. You are putting yourself into a position of excessive extension of the lumbar spine, which for most people isn't very good." We'll start with that as an initial quote. Mark, you have any immediate thoughts there?
Just to quickly touch on what Andrew said, there's not really an idea for me to discuss. Like you said, it's more about these causal inferences that he's making and these leaps that he's making. And if I were to discuss anything, it would be judgment of him as a scientist potentially. So I'm not going to touch on that. In terms of what Jeff said about you can incur pretty serious injuries while asleep, I'm going to disagree with that completely. I'm not really sure how you would incur pretty serious injuries while asleep if they didn't already exist, or if there wasn't something else involved, meaning someone is inebriated and they fall asleep in a certain position and then they wake up and their hand is asleep or whatever it is, right? They have some kind of nerve palsy. So I'm going to disagree with you can incur pretty serious injuries while asleep. I don't think we as humans would be here today if we were going through hundreds and thousands of years of injuries while sleeping. In terms of the stomach thing, this is something that I also disagree with, and it's not really shown in the literature. And my general recommendation is if you have pain while sleeping on your stomach, it makes complete sense to adopt a different position. If you have difficulty breathing while sleeping on your stomach, like if you have sleep apnea, then it makes sense to sleep in a different position. And if you were going to choose between sideline and supine, if you have sleep apnea, the general recommendation is sideline. But I don't understand this sweeping generalization, not just from Jeff, but that we see on the internet as a whole from a lot of healthcare practitioners, even sleep experts, sleep researchers, scientists. They just say sleeping on your back is bad or dangerous because of the extension that it puts your lumbar spine in and the stress that it places on your back. And once again, unless it causes you pain in the moment, or you tend to notice that you wake up with worse symptoms or whatever it may be, or you have difficulty breathing because of the position, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with sleeping on your stomach.
Yeah, you've created a full YouTube video on this topic and give those caveats, or if someone has lateral hip pain, laying on that particular side may be uncomfortable in those periods of that period of time in their life, but that doesn't mean they need to avoid it forever. And those other caveats of if it is sleep apnea, maybe there are more preferred or better positions, but outside of that, maybe we shouldn't be so hyper vigilant about how people sleep. Adding to that, Jeff has a little remark about, I think he does it pretty quickly, but it was, I think, still on the point of sleep on your stomach. He goes, if you're a disc patient, I guess that might be helpful for relocating the disc. For most people, try to adopt another position. He doesn't elaborate there, but it to me seems like the assumption from him is that being in that extended position, if you have symptoms that are potentially contributing from a disc injury or disc-based injury, that it's going to quote unquote relocate the disc. I don't know if we want to dive into that, but that is probably a false assumption and claim as well.
Yeah, I'm assuming he's referring to if somebody has a disc herniation, what you'll see on the internet oftentimes is the automatic suggestion to do like repeated extensions. So like, hands on your back, arching your back, or just lying on your stomach and then avoiding flexion or flexed positions. But that's not a recommendation that we can just apply broadly. It has to be based on the individual. And this is the same recommendation for avoiding positions that are uncomfortable. If you do have symptoms and sleeping in a certain position feels better for those symptoms, then it probably makes sense to adopt those positions. Is it actually going to change the anatomy of your intervertebral disc? Probably not. I'm not sure what he's referring. I could guess what he's referring to with respect to relocating the disc, but it's probably not the best description of what he's trying to describe, and it's not going to be the thing that's actually happening just based on your sleep position. Like if you slept in a flex position, that disc herniation isn't going to extrude more, protrude more, or bulge more, depending on what it is. And sleeping on your stomach or a more extended position isn't going to cause that disc material to resorb.
From there, this is a quote, his answer: people laying on their side bring their knees up to their chest, prolonged hip flexion. Listen, we are doing enough of that during the day. We don't have to do another 10 hours or 8 hours of something at night like that. You're just reinforcing muscle shortening overnight. Again, any immediate remarks or thoughts there, Marc?
Yeah, your muscles aren't going to be shortening by sleeping overnight. That's not a thing that happens. Sleeping on your side is fine. It's actually the preferred sleeping position for most people. I don't have the percentages up in front of me, but like you said, I did a YouTube video about it. I have a blog on the topic. The research is there. The research on sleep in general, as it relates to pain and injuries, isn't super extensive, but the recommendations that I'm making and the things that I'm saying are based on that research. And but then there is research, in terms of people's preferred sleeping positions, and sideline is the preferred sleeping position. Just for people listening, I sleep on my side and I don't use a pillow for my head, which probably sounds crazy because you hear this recommendation that, once again, which is inaccurate, that you have to sleep with like a neutral spine and you have to sleep with a neutral curve in your neck. And there's probably times when I'm sleeping on my side and my head is just flopping around. But I discovered for myself that oftentimes when sleeping with a pillow, my neck actually was more sore the morning after. That was just something that I experimented with, of like, okay, everything remains the same if I use no pillow versus using a pillow. Which one feels better? For me, no pillow feels better. So that's just what I've adopted over time. And my neck feels fine. I have no neck issues. So yeah.
You're one of the few others that I've ever met in this world that doesn't use a pillow like myself. Brothers for life. My ears just get too hot. I just get in the middle of the night, I wake up. If there's a pillow, my ears get really hot. It's a weird sensation, but I sleep with no pillow and my neck feels great. Jeff then goes on to same topic, different quote. He says, one of the reasons I recommend static stretching before going to bed at night is because it's good to establish this longer length temporarily prior to going into a state where you are going to be not moving and recovering and creating changes in the muscle. Thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, I do think that movement before bed can be helpful, but not for the reason stated. And if his understanding is that when you sleep in a certain position, let's say sideline, and your muscles become shortened, if that's truly his belief, then to me it seems a little bit counterintuitive that if you did, let's say, 30 seconds of hip flexor stretching, that's going to actually counteract 7 to 9 hours of being in a hip flex position. But maybe that's a different thing to discuss. But one, I think it could be helpful for relaxation. I don't think it's uncommon for people to go from watching Netflix or working on their computers or staring at their phone and going directly to bed. Whereas maybe doing some of this stretching and movement is just a way to wind your mind down and also take a break from the screen between looking at the screen and actually trying to go to sleep. And one thing that I've mentioned in the past, I don't know if I've mentioned it on the podcast, is that I think a lot of people have this idea that they wake up and, let's say, hurt their back or their neck or their shoulder, and it's because they slept wrong. And you certainly can maybe sleep in a position for a prolonged period of time with minimal movement and wake up a little bit sore. I gave the more extreme example of being inebriated, but I actually mentioned it in a recent YouTube video where people will blame their sleeping position for why their back is a little bit sore in the morning, but maybe not consider that, hey, they were watching football, American football, all day Sunday, having drinks throughout the day, not getting up off the couch, super sedentary, and then they just go to sleep, and then they wake up sore and say, oh, it was my sleeping position, when maybe being a little bit more active the day before, periodically throughout the day, periodically throughout the week, might actually diminish the frequency of you waking up feeling stiff or sore. And I've definitely found that for myself. If I'm on the computer all day, I'm more likely to have a, quote unquote, sleep wrong versus, or if I'm, really stressed out and all of these things are happening, versus if I'm being a little bit more physically active, I'm making sure to get the necessary sleep that I need, I'm a little bit less stressed, it's very unlikely that I'm going to, once again, quote unquote, sleep wrong. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Like, you probably see patients, right, that go like, oh, I slept wrong last night and my neck hurts.
Yeah, that's common. Or they'll be like, yeah, my neck or my back. And then I'll say, yeah, there's probably a high chance that that goes away in a few days. They're like, yeah, it's happened before. So I think we both kind of just brush it off. To your point, I don't think there's a downside to static stretching before bed, as that process and habit of shifting away from a work or another activity before going to bed. But to his kind of statement on it's establishing this longer length, one, there's not going to be long-term change based off of a static stretch held at night. And then let's say even if there is some temporary change, you're going into sleeping in a variety of other positions for on average 8 hours. What's really the goal there? And I think the goal would be biasing the recommendation or the suggestion as this can be relaxation and a habit and a process before going to bed, just to let you calm down, as opposed to viewing it as a postural or corrective or preventative measure.
Yeah, I agree with that. And another thing that I want to add, like I don't do static stretching before bed, just so that's clear. But I think also being careful not to get into this, like, I don't know if it's a productivity trap or this optimal lifestyle trap. You know, I know Andrew Huberman is big on that, where it's like you do these 5 things upon waking up, and you do these, take these supplements, and you do these things throughout the day, and you probably do these things before bed. And before you know it, it's like a full-time job, and it's pretty exhausting and daunting. So if you are gonna do static stretching or whatever it may be, just as long as it's relaxing, enjoyable, actually does something for you. You know, I know I've gone through periods where Nicole and I will try to be consistent with meditating before bed, and it just ends up being more work, and it makes me more stressed out because I'm like, man, I'm super busy tonight, but I got to find the 30 minutes to do this meditation, and this is just stressing me out. Like I just want to chill. So, you know, making sure not to fall into that trap.
In grad school, I tried the Headspace meditation app because I was super stressed out. And every night, I don't know why this was my position, but I would lay on my back on the floor, and then my feet would be on my bed, or my lower legs would be. And I would listen to this beautiful Australian voice, this man, and it would be like a 7-minute guided meditation, and I would pass out. But then I would have to take a shower, because I always take a shower right before I go to bed. So it'd be like I'd calm down because I was so exhausted. This man talking to me, but I wouldn't really be meditating. I would just be like getting more tired, which that is the goal. And then I would shower and then go to bed. I didn't view it as a chore. I just view it as like, oh, I take a little quick nap before I take a shower, and then I can go to bed. Yeah, there's so many other ways people can find routines and ways to be in a better state to go to bed. And stretching can be one of many options.
Yeah, you probably find this crazy. Nicole does. I've been trying to adjust my routine a little bit, but like going to the gym at 8 p.m. and then being in bed by 10 p.m., which probably sounds wild to people, but to me, it works out really well. Like go to the gym, come back, shower, maybe do a little bit of reading, and then I just pass out. No problem.
You do that, or Nicole does it?
I'll do that.
Ugh.
No, Nicole can't work out that late.
Wow. Okay. Internal and external rotation, upright row versus high row, another topic within this podcast episode. It's around the minute or the hour and 13-minute mark. Andrew asks Jeff, please tell us about internal and external rotation, the upright row, and why this is important for posture and mechanics. And Jeff says, the shoulder has the most mobility out of any joint in the entire body, but it has the least stability. There's always that trade-off, mobility versus stability. When you think about the imbalance that is created just by nature and how we live our lives, internal rotation far, far outweighs external rotation. So you need to address it. You need to normalize those biomechanics of the shoulder. Marc.
Yeah, I would just wonder if he applies this same logic to everywhere else, if there are other movements that he thinks we bias more than another based on our activities of daily living, if he's also really pushing the opposite movement, I guess. I don't disagree that movement variability is good. I'm actually a fan of it, but I don't think we can just inherently say, like, at least what I'm kind of gathering is that external rotation, really good. Internal rotation, maybe not as good. I don't think we can say that. But I don't disagree. Sure. Like, if you're doing some internal rotation, throw in some external rotation. But I always try to simplify it. And that would be my thing. Like, hey, you do a lot of push-ups and bench pressing at the gym, throw in some rows. Which, it seems like that would make sense, as opposed to, there's some people who say like, oh, you need to do a 3-to-1 pull to pushing ratio, which are just numbers pulled out of thin air. It's just like, hey, you do some of one thing, maybe do some of the other. Hey, you do a lot of resistance training, maybe throw in some cardio every once in a while. Maybe throw in some plyometrics. Maybe play a sport. Just do something different. But simplifying it.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if it was after, I think it was before that response, but Andrew again discussed something that he had taken from Jeff, this kind of static resting position to know how much internal rotation you're in, where you just essentially look at your hand position. And if your thumbs are pointing forward versus pointing towards your body, that can be an indicator that you have more quote unquote tightness in the anterior part of your body, or you're more internally rotated, and that's somehow inherently bad, or that needs to be fixed. Again, a kind of a claim that would have a lot of kind of leaps in assumptions, and it really doesn't correlate with what we know from the literature. Variety of postures that are totally fine to live in. They don't have to be changed, and everyone has these different resting positions, and those positions change throughout the day based off what they're doing, based off their attitude, etc. He then goes on to say, Jeff goes on to say, we have digital motion x-rays that will literally show the impingement occurring in real time in real function. And this is assuming he's talking about shoulder impingement occurring in real time. Mark, you want to elaborate on that statement?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to there, like if there's a specific study that he's referencing. I have made a YouTube video and a blog about shoulder impingement. We've had some really good researchers on the podcast. Jared Powell, Lori Mishner, and others who have also talked about this concept. So I'm just going to pull a little bit from my blog, which obviously cites the literature. But one thing to know is that impingement happens with just arm elevation. So it's a normal thing that occurs, and it occurs in symptomatic people, and it occurs in asymptomatic people. And it would be like taking your hip, through a certain range of motion. Like, you might have some bone contact. Like, it's normal, and it's not something necessarily to pathologize. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Usually when shoulder impingement is stated, it's used in a way that's like pathological, when I don't know if it is pathological. And then it's also important to know that it most commonly occurs at like less than 60 degrees of elevation. So anytime you're lifting your arm any degree, like I'm standing and my arms are resting on my desk here. If I just lift my arms off my desk, there is a possibility that I'm creating some impingement, and I don't feel it. I don't have any symptoms. That was from Lawrence et al. In 2019, and there's also a systematic review by Lawrence et al. And one quote from that group is that the smallest distance between the rotator cuff tendon insertion and coracoacromial arch occurs between 40 and 75 degrees of humerothoracic elevation, shoulder elevation. So once again, that kind of falls in line with the different study, or the individual study, for saying like, below 75 degrees, but usually even less, you're at risk for that, quote unquote impingement. And then just kind of building off of that, these are two more quotes. So this is from one study. Research demonstrates that the rotator cuff actually moves out of the way of this kind of impingement by 90 degrees of elevation, and maybe as low as like 65 to 70 degrees, which is, still similar to the other numbers that I quoted, which means that it's not even in a position, like the supraspinatus wouldn't even be in a position to be impinged because it's the way that the humerus is moving. It's kind of moved out of the way. And then going back to that systematic review by Lawrence and all that I just mentioned, they state in most individuals, the rotator cuff has passed medially under the acromion and is no longer in a position to be compressed by 90 degrees of humerothoracic elevation. And then furthermore, contact between the rotator cuff and coracoacromial arch may occur even in asymptomatic individuals. So yeah, we'll probably do a whole nother episode on just like shoulder impingement and upright rows at some point. But generally the recommendation is, hey, avoid upright rows, especially to like 90 degrees, because the higher you lift your arms, the more impingement you're going to put your shoulders in. And in actuality, the rotator cuff might be moved out of the way of that impingement, and just lifting your arm, internal rotation or not, there's a possibility that impingement is occurring. That was a long-winded answer.
In my understanding is that impingement, and if you Google it, it seems it's just two structures or two things moving closer together. And it's not good or bad. It's just the reality of moving joints through space. And like you said, sometimes there can be symptoms and sometimes there's not in certain positions when you move. And so maybe for some people that row or that high position, the upright row, can create irritation, but that can be from a variety of factors outside of this quote unquote impingement, which is just generally that those structures are getting closer throughout some of that range. But is it because there was just too much total volume? The speed was too great? It was, what other factors are potentially creating some shoulder irritation in that row? And does it inherently need to be demonized? And the answer would be no.
Yeah, so many structures are impinged and compressed and pushed and pulled, nerves, muscles, like all day long, and we don't think about it, and we don't pathologize most of those. One thing that I thought about, and I don't know if this is an original idea, it probably isn't, and I probably heard it from someone else, potentially with the upright row, why is it challenging, or why is it uncomfortable, or why is the internal rotation, sometimes problematic for people? And maybe it's an overload of those tendons, right? Like if you already have a symptomatic, let's say, rotator cuff, and maybe one of the external rotators, and now you're holding a load that's pulling your arms into relative internal rotation, and you're elevating your shoulders, like you're loading the tendon. And it might be loading the tendon much heavier than what you're used to in a range of motion that you're not used to. And so it might make sense that, hey, you overload it. It might be problematic, but if you improved your capacity and tolerance for that loading over time, it's probably not going to be an issue. Like I did that snatch video with Quinn, where he taught me how to snatch. And the intention of the pull is for the bar to be weightless, and you get under the bar during the pull as you get into the overhead position. I was unable to accomplish that. Like I was doing upright row after upright row, which is not an exercise that I do. And it was hard, but it was fine.
Jeff goes on to state, if your muscles aren't strong, you're asking for trouble every time you do that. This exercise is literally putting you into elevation and internal rotation. And then he goes on to kind of describe, if you go to PT clinic, they would induce this exact position, the Hawkins-Kennedy impingement test. And he's essentially referring to this because this is a test and this is a quote unquote impingement test, and you're doing that as an exercise. How is that a good idea? And we've already kind of alluded to all these reasons, but maybe, Mark, do you want to just kind of briefly touch on the Hawkins-Kennedy test or some of these impingement tests in general? Like you said, we've already had researchers and clinicians come on and talk about this. Another one was Paul Salam talking about some of the lack of, reliability and validity of these shoulder special tests. But what are your overall thoughts with that quote and his statement?
Yeah, I think it's a counter argument that a lot of people use. Like, the upright row is silly, and you take a snapshot right next to someone doing the Hawkins Kennedy, which is like you said, you're elevating the shoulder and you're kind of moving them into this internal rotation. It looks exactly the same as the position that physical therapy clinicians test for this impingement. But we've known for a while that it's not a really valid test of anything. It tells us that someone's shoulder hurts. That potentially, if you put them in this position and you wiggle their shoulder around and they already have a symptomatic shoulder, that it might hurt, but it doesn't really give us anything specific. And, for the students or clinicians listening, and you mentioned Paul Salam, and, he wrote that paper, what is it, like putting the special test out to pasture, probably a couple years ago now. But there also have been really good reviews, systematic reviews by Eric Hegedus and a group of other like shoulder researchers that really go through a lot of those shoulder special tests and tells you which ones are maybe more useful to use, maybe using them in a cluster. But once again, the Hawkins Kennedy isn't a very useful or valid thing, other than to tell you that the person's shoulder hurts. And I'm going to imagine, I've never seen you practice. I don't know what you do. I imagine that you probably don't use the Hawkins Kennedy test.
No, I'll generally check active range of motion in the shoulder, cervical spine, passive range. I ask them what positions are most irritable to them. And if it's not one of those kind of basic testing positions, then I want to see how that position looks and have them describe it, and then do some load-based testing through dynamometry and a variety of shoulder positions, but none of the shoulder special tests. To that systematic review, I think one of the ones they said that has good validity and reliability and can much better inform decision making is kind of an apprehension test to determine, is this truly a shoulder that has either had multiple subluxations or dislocations, and in that kind of 90-90 layback position, are they having this sense of, I feel like my shoulder is extremely unstable? So that is one of the few true kind of shoulder special tests that I'll utilize for certain demographics where they're presenting with that report or actual experience of true shoulder instability.
Yeah, the tests need to inform your management. Like, if I already know someone has shoulder pain, I don't need to reproduce their shoulder pain with this test because it doesn't really do anything useful for me. It's similar to, it's been so long since I used it, and I just learned it in school. Maybe it's like Clark's test or compression test for like the patella. And it was, if someone had patellofemoral pain, you create like a C shape with your hand, and you place it above the patella, and you kind of hold it inferiorly, and then you ask them to squeeze their quad, or you can even kind of compress the patella. And if it's painful, it's like, oh, they have, patellofemoral pain. And it's like, I don't need to put them in significant pain to hypothesize that their knee hurts.
Yeah, it is kind of wild how many special tests there are, and then how many were taught in school, and we had to prep for on boards, and how very little of those I actually utilize day to day. Next section, this may be our last one. Maybe one or two after this. Back pain relief, medial glutes, and body pain was kind of the topic of this subsection. It was around the hour 26-minute mark for people who actually want to go back and watch or listen. Andrew discusses his own experience with low back pain and his initial, as he's saying, it was his initial belief that it was stemming from his back. But then realizing that it was coming from his glute med, and he started doing all these glute exercises multiple times a day with symptom relief. And then he said, lo and behold, my back pain is gone. Again, another kind of personal experience that Andrew shares that we could easily elaborate on. What are those caveats that we should probably provide as to why he may have had symptom relief outside of those specific exercises? Yeah, Mark, what are your thoughts?
For the listeners, I want people to know that when people make claims like these, and we can even go back to the sleeping one that he made. Chris actually talked about this on one of our more recent episodes. Like, what else can explain the results that he's coming to? And you might ask, like, okay, he is having pain while sleeping and maybe waking up with pain, and he's wondering, what can I do to improve my sleep? He might associate it with his sheets being tucked in and these tibialis exercises, but I can almost guarantee that he did a lot more than that, most likely, to try to improve his sleep, right? When someone tries to make a positive health change or behavior change, they're not just doing one thing. So he might be saying, man, I've been getting really poor sleep and waking up not feeling well. I'm going to improve my nighttime routine. I'm going to make sure that I get 7 to 9 hours of sleep at night. I'm going to make sure that I'm sleeping in a cool, dark room. I'm going to make sure that I'm exercising on a regular basis. I'm going to make sure that I'm like, he's probably doing everything possible to improve his sleep. But the one thing that he associates, or that may improve his sleep, but the one thing that he's associating with improving his sleep is his sheets being tucked in and the tibialis exercise. The same thing with this is that, he's experiencing low back pain, and maybe he started doing these, glute exercises multiple times per day, but also maybe it meant he's sitting less, and maybe the sitting was a thing that was aggravating for him. And once again, maybe he's trying to sleep more and stress. Like, there's all of these other factors. So it's really hard to say, like, I did this one thing, when in actuality, like, none of those things live in a vacuum.
Totally. And that was something that I was going to touch on or add on if you didn't, was it's not inherently bad that he's doing these kind of glute biased or glute med biased exercises, but do they have to be done for everyone, or what are the potential other things that helped improve his symptoms? Or let's say it was significantly from those exercises. Was it because he was training the glute med, or was it because he was just generally moving in other positions? They were novel exercises. He had other sensations around the back that were stronger in nature, that were more novel and analgesic potentially. So there's all these other explanations. So he gives his kind of experience, and then he goes on to ask Jeff, how should people think about pain? And Jeff says, as the glute medius tightens down, it can actually press on the sciatic nerve and give what they call a pseudosciatica. It's not caused from a disc. It's caused by the fact that this glute medius has posturally become a problem for you, or weak, because you don't train it and you have to address it. There are common trigger points where the muscle will become tightened or painful or spasmed, and you can basically apply pressure to these areas and thread that muscle through the pressure by pushing down through there and contracting the muscle. That tends to help you almost knead out that trigger point, end quote. There's a lot there, Mark. What are your thoughts from that kind of paragraph response?
So I think this is I'm giving Jeff the benefit of the doubt here. Like, this is to show that we're not trying to attack any individual. I don't think that he thinks that the sciatic nerve is exiting under the gluteus medius. It's a possibility that he misspoke. I told Chris that I listened back to like the glute amnesia episode, and I misspoke on so many occasions. And if someone just listened to that episode and like considered my intelligence on the topic at face value. They'd be like, oh, this guy doesn't know anything. Because I think I said like deadlift under the squat category when it came out. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Glutes, innervated, superior gluteal nerve, inferior gluteal nerve. Maybe he's referring to some of those nerves. You definitely can have referred pain, and potentially you push on some of your glutes hard enough. Maybe you have some localized pain and some referred pain. But overall, it's a lot. There's a lot to discuss within that quote.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot to unpack, yeah.
And I don't know, we're almost an hour in. I don't know if it's necessary, but I think it's one, you kind of correcting potentially what he may have meant and assuming he could have meant something else or misspoke. But then again, it's kind of these leaps and assumptions. We would have to unpack trigger points. Are they actually a thing? Can they be palpated? Can they be changed? If they even are a thing, then the muscle becoming tight or painful or spasm. So there's a lot there, but I think just kind of verbally reading what he said, we may not even have to elaborate much because I think it's apparent, the amount of leaps and assumptions that were made just by saying his explanation. And he kind of, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to provide a little bit of clarity, because you said it quickly for people listening, trigger points are not really things that we know exist. Like we speak about them as if they exist and they, are a specific entity, and we know exactly what they are and what they do and how to manage them. And in reality, we know that people can sometimes have sore spots, but that's about it. There's not really sufficient evidence to support the use of the phrase trigger point and for anybody to be really confident in what they are. At least that's my understanding of the current scientific literature.
He then, within the same question that Andrew asked him, he then kind of goes down into patellar tendonitis, and he gives this example of, it's not the knee. The knee is literally a hinge joint and it's being impacted by the hip and the ankle and the foot. What would happen if your foot collapses? Who's going to feel the most? The knee. And I think what he's trying to discuss here is that if there's symptoms at one joint in the body or one specific region, you have to look above or below, or you have to assume potentially or consider things going on below that region, like the foot, if you're having knee pain. And he, I think, is trying to also explain that with maybe some back pain, you have to look other places. And I think potentially Marc would agree that sometimes there is a rationale or reason to look at other regions of the body as to why other areas there may be referred pain, there may be radiating symptoms, there may be true other areas that may need to be addressed. But I think classifying it as like the structure or the position of the foot collapse is the reason why there's knee pain, I think that's where that is a false statement. We've also had guests on this podcast talk about things like foot pronation and flat feet and how there's a poor correlation with foot pain and ankle pain. Again, this kind of overly structuralist or causative explanation for someone's joint position or presentation as to having symptoms at that region of their body or above or below.
Yeah, once again, I don't think there's any harm in training other regions of the body, and maybe even some benefit, right? You have low back pain. Is there harm in training your glute medius? Probably not. Can there be some benefit? Probably. If you have patellar tendinopathy, is there any harm in training your foot or hip and ankle? Probably not. Is there benefit? Maybe. But the knee is one of those things, right, where it's like it's not the knee. And I think there are other social media individuals who will say something similar, but really you're just asking how much force can this knee extensor mechanism tolerate? And this is, you mentioned we've had other guests, like that's like Eric Maida. Like, how much can this knee extensor mechanism tolerate? And if it can tolerate the amount that you're putting through it, probably doesn't matter if you have a little hip pronation or ankle pronation or foot pronation and something happening at the hip, because your knee can tolerate that force.
Last topic, and this one will be short. Physical recovery, heat and cold exposure. This is around an hour and 44 minutes in. Andrew asking Jeff about heat and cold recommendations. Essentially, when does he use it? How would he recommend it? And Jeff says, he caveat that in the past when he was working with baseball players, he used to use ice for them, but not a lot of heat. Doesn't really give a ton of elaboration as to why. But then he says, now it's personal preference. There's no standard anymore for heat or cold in that way. And I again didn't listen to the whole 2 hours and 45 minutes, but from these specific chunks, this was one of the first times where he kind of discussed more of the updated research in a manner that seems appropriate or like in line. And he said, really, there's no standard from the evidence or from what we know. And then he said, from a post-workout recovery status, I have not used much heat or cold in terms of what we do. So he was really agnostic about either heat or cold. And again, I was surprised by that. And I think I'm pretty sure Andrew wanted him to have stronger opinions on it one way or another, because I think Andrew's a big fan of some of those things. But I guess I'll go first. I agree with this, and having discussions with patients, a lot of times I just say, if you're already doing it and you find value and you like it, heat or cold, continue rock and roll. If you're not doing it, I'm not going to enforce you to do it. It's largely up to you. And it's, again, these short-term modifications, and maybe it feels better for a little bit, but it's not long-term change in anything that we physiologically know of.
Yeah, I mostly agree with Jeff's statement as well. The evidence around heat and cold exposure as it relates to like injury, pain, recovery, like from a rehab standpoint, is very limited. And from what we know, it probably doesn't make much of a difference either way. And so when people make these really strong claims like you should never ice after an injury, that's not really based on any data. That's just, what's being said, or it's just like very mechanistic data in rats. And I'm actually making a little short on that. And then, or they'll say the person who came out with the rice protocol now denounces, use of ice, when in reality, that doctor still recommends ice acutely after an injury. That's just left out. And I also think that like maybe we shouldn't widespread adopt a protocol because one person recommended it, and maybe we shouldn't widespread de-adopt a protocol because one person denounced it. That's probably not a good way to go about practice, and that's how things get picked up and spread really quickly. Instead, let's look at the data, and the data is very limited. So yeah, personal preference is probably fine in most cases, outside of like contraindications or safety reasons.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. This was a extremely long podcast. It was almost 3 hours. We took bits and pieces, and I try not to cherry pick. And I also try to, like I said at the beginning, find sections where generally I am assuming Marc would have agreed, or there wasn't a complete disagreement, and then areas where I think we needed to provide some other perspective. if people like this format, let us know. This is a little trial experiment to see how it goes. Obviously, there's so many topics and conversations that are occurring through these type of mediums, through podcast or YouTube or shorts or TikTok or whatever, that can be discussed. But to Mark's point, it's endless. And if it's valuable to people, great. If not, we got other topics and things to discuss and people to interview. Any final thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, if people like it, they can send us ideas, send us certain podcast episodes, topics. Personally, I am planning, like I said, to make more like YouTube shorts and reels discussing other people's ideas and trying to do so somewhat diplomatically as opposed to being, too blunt. Because like I said, I'm not trying to attack the person, and I also don't want our listeners to go and attack the person. We're not trying to create these tribes. We're just trying to be skeptical and discuss certain ideas.
Totally. We will call it there. Thanks for coming on, Mark.